Thanks everyone for being here. I'm very excited to be introducing Professor Meira Levinson, and I'm very much looking forward to her keynote address today, which is entitled Why We Need a Field of Educational Ethics. So Professor Meira Levinson is Professor of Education at Harvard University. She's a normative political philosopher who writes about civic education, multiculturalism, youth empowerment, and educational ethics. In doing so, she draws upon scholarship from multiple disciplines, as well as her 8 years of experience teaching in the Atlanta and Boston public schools. Her most recent books include the co-edited Making Civics Count and No Citizen Left Behind, the latter of which shows how schools can help tackle a civic empowerment gap that is as shameful and anti-democratic as the academic achievement gap targeted by No Child Left Behind. In 2013, this book was awarded the Michael Harrington Award from the American Political Science Association, the Exemplary Research in Social Studies Award from the National Council for the Social Studies, and a Critics' Choice Award from the American Educational Studies Association. So it's very impressive. It also won the 2014 North American Society for Social Philosophy Book Award. Professor Levinson fosters civic education scholarship at Harvard as co-convener of HGSE's Civic and Moral Education Initiative. She has been awarded a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship to support her newest project on justice in schools. In this work, she combines philosophical analysis and school-based case studies to illuminate the complex dimensions of evaluating, achieving, and teaching justice in schools. The project is intended to give educators tools for making just decisions in their own practice, and also to push political theorists to develop theories of social justice that are robust enough to address complex school-based dilemmas. This project, like her previous research, reflects her commitment to achieving productive cross-fertilisation without loss of rigour amongst scholarship, policy and practice. So it's not only theoretically robust but practically achievable and impressive. So I'm going to commence her keynote now, and away we go.
Thank you so much for inviting me to give this address. I'm incredibly sorry not to be there in person, but I do hope that through the miracles of digital technology, we can have a chance to have a real live conversation about the ideas I'm about to share. I should say I'm sharing ideas that are very much in process, although I'll be making an argument in particular about why we need a field of educational ethics. You'll also hear me asking a bunch of questions along the way. I really look forward in the Q&A to think with and to learn from you. So, on to the argument. Educators, including teachers and school leaders, face challenging ethical decisions on a regular basis, ranging over an enormous landscape, from curriculum to discipline to assessment to family engagement to politics and much more. Let me offer 4 brief examples. First, discipline. David is a student who's struggling academically, let's say. He frequently tries to mask his struggles by playing the class clown, which disrupts other students' learning. How should his teachers balance David's needs against those of his classmates in responding to his outbursts? Second, consider grade inflation, which a number of studies have shown is rampant worldwide, including in Australia. Should department heads enforce stringent grading standards to establish an ethos of excellence and academic rigor? Or turn a blind eye to grade inflation because it helps students secure admission to selective universities and to higher paying jobs? Third, politics. A number of elections and referenda have been held in various countries over the past 18 months that pit nationalist, populist, and/or authoritarian demagogues against more democratically oriented candidates. Teachers in government schools are rightly expected to remain nonpartisan, but they are also expected to teach democratic and civic values. Given this, should teachers in government schools have remained nonpartisan in the most recent elections in, say, the United States, France, or Austria? Fourth, let me give you an example about a dilemma of educational ethics that has to do with family engagement and curriculum. So a school that serves a predominantly conservative Christian student body is being pressured by its parent association to remove sexual orientation and gender diversity awareness from its health and wellness curriculum. If it does not, then the parents have indicated that they will opt their children out from the entire course, which is permitted by the regional school authority. How should the school respond? So those were examples about educators themselves and the policy and the ethical dilemmas they face. Let's now turn to, say, education policy makers, who also frequently confront ethical dilemmas. For example, should a high-achieving, no-excuses school be required to reduce its well above average attrition rates as a condition of expanding if its academic success rests in part on students' and families' compliance with its expectations? Or a second question, how should a financially strapped school system balance its budget? By eliminating gifted and talented programs, charging fees for extracurricular activities, or, say, eliminating supports for new teachers? Or to take a third example, data from a new statewide teacher evaluation program reveal that male teachers of color receive significantly lower scores than other teachers with comparable levels of experience in comparable settings. This puts them at risk of losing merit pay or even being reassigned or fired. How should the state respond? These aren't exotic problems, I hope you realize. These are kind of everyday dilemmas for both policymakers and for educators. But educators and policymakers generally receive little support in thinking them through, other than as technocratic challenges of leadership, data analysis, or instruction. So they're rarely treated as ethical challenges, that is, as challenges that require educators and policymakers to think carefully about the values and the moral principles at stake. This is despite the fact that educators, school board members, school and district administrators, and also parents and citizens frequently agonize over just these questions. Last year, for instance, I heard and participated in literally dozens of conversations in my state in Massachusetts about a ballot question, which was about whether more charter schools should be allowed to open every year. School committee members, parents, and citizens were trying to work out what ethical values and how ethical values should inform collective decisions about education policy. With respect to education practice, I've been spending significant time in the last 18 months or so leading professional development sessions with social studies teachers about teaching Trump. In one session last September, two veteran teachers literally started to cry as they posed their commitments to open dialogue and critical inquiry against their commitments to student safety, mutual civic respect, and anti-racist education. I realize I'm about to traffic in stereotypes, but I was especially taken aback by the tears because both teachers were male coaches. One coaches American football and the other wrestling. These kinds of anguished responses to ethical dilemmas in education are not rare, nor, of course, are they confined to election years. One might imagine that those who care about educational ethics could turn to moral and political philosophers, say, for guidance. But these fields, frankly, offer comparatively little insight. This is in part because moral and political theorists address surprisingly few questions about education in any depth. They've written about school finance, accommodation of cultural and religious diversity, such as, say, the conservative Christian parents I talked about earlier, parents' rights, the aims of education, and distinctions between education and indoctrination. But I would say a vast number of other fundamental questions have been virtually ignored, including many of the kinds of dilemmas that I raised at the beginning of this talk. Even more to the point, when educational issues are discussed by moral and political theorists, they tend to apply generalist moral and political theories to often quite stylized education problems. But I think that one can get only so far with general normative theories that have been developed for and about adults, about people who are presumed by these theories to have relatively fixed capacities, to be reasonable, responsible, and rational, and to have present-day interests that matter deeply and likely even trump their far-in-the-future interests. Such presuppositions render these moral and political theories unable to address basic features of the educational landscape. Any approach to educational ethics that is worth its salt, for instance, must recognize that from a developmental perspective, children are often appropriately non-compliant, unreasonable, and even irrational. In order to work out the ethical trade-offs at work in dealing with a disruptive student, say, like David that I talked about at the beginning, one therefore needs a normative theory that treats the disruption of other people's projects as a predictable and even normal feature of childhood. What would an ethical system look like that took widespread unreasonableness as a given, while still aiming to show its subjects respect, which children are definitely due, and to help them become more reasonable over time? This question, I think, reveals a second necessary feature of theorizing about educational ethics, namely that it offers an account about the relationship between children's present day and future well-being. Many no excuses schools here in the United States, for example, justify their practices of giving demerits to children as young as 5 for slumping in their seats or simply looking out of the window, on the grounds that their students tend to come from communities in which fewer than 10% of kindergarteners normally graduate from university. In order to ensure that zip code or postcode is not destiny, these schools enforce rigorous behavioral expectations in the here and now so that their students have a much higher shot of graduating from university and living safe, productive, and happy adult lives for decades to come. Is this ethical to profoundly restrict children's natural impulses and present-day well-being for the sake of future well-being? This is an essential question to answer, but one that moral and political theorists offer little guidance about because they tend to theorize about already formed and often presumptively autonomous agents. Other features of educational ethics are distinct from generalized moral and political theory as well. For example, children's natural endowments are in many ways socially constructed through schooling itself. Furthermore, since their future capabilities to learn are developed or retarded by schools, educational ethics is also recursive. Difference is both an input and an output. Part of the task of any theory of educational ethics is thus to set boundaries around the social construction of difference, around incoming difference, outgoing difference, and differences required to mediate children's pathways between the two. How to address the ethics of cutting gifted and talented programs versus charging for extracurricular activities depends on having insights into these kinds of considerations. Other distinctive features of educational ethics include the need to theorize distributive justice and corrective ethics simultaneously, since how one deals with a disruptive student has complex consequences for children's academic and moral learning, and relatedly, how individual and collective needs and rights should be addressed simultaneously, since children are almost always grouped together in a class. Given these distinctive kinds of questions, raised by even a cursory consideration of ethical challenges that arise in schools, I believe that we need a new field of educational ethics. We do not just need more work applying extant ethical theory to educational problems, nor solely more work translating extant scholarship to policy and practice, although each of those may well be useful. I believe that we actually need new work that asks distinctive questions, draws on distinctive sources and kinds of evidence, including empirical educational research and practical insight, and that generates knowledge for a distinctive set of audiences. So how should we get there, and what models are available to guide us or to throw cautions our way? So when I look around for models, the obvious and virtually the only one that springs into view is actually bioethics. This is because from the beginning, bioethicists were clear that they needed to ask new kinds of questions that moral and political philosophers had not asked, and that they needed to pursue new modes of scholarship that incorporated scientific and medical understanding in addition to philosophical inquiry. I also think that bioethics is an interesting model because it literally did not exist as a field 60 years ago. It only came into being in the late 1960s and 1970s, and academic positions in this field, as well as clinical positions, are even more recent. Despite its comparatively brief history, however, bioethics has achieved phenomenal outcomes. It has generated essential insights into both individual-level biomedicine and population-level public health research, policy, and practice. These include the ethics of abortion and end-of-life decisions, genetic testing use, human subjects research, stem cell research, healthcare resource allocation, and quality-adjusted life years, say, among many other insights. Furthermore, clinical bioethicists are directly employed by or retained as consultants by major hospitals, public health departments, and NGOs such as the World Health Organization and Doctors Without Borders. Philosophy departments, medical schools, and public health schools also have regular tenure lines in bioethics, as do some law schools, public policy schools, religion departments, and nursing schools. It is now literally unimaginable for the field of bioethics not to exist. So in some ways, if we want to try to create a field of educational ethics, bioethics seems like a really great model. But at the same time, bioethics has some significant weaknesses, ones that may well be inseparable from its strengths. It's widely criticized for having weak intellectual foundations and poor average quality of work. One reason for this may be the explosion of jobs since the field was founded. It's simply hard to scale up a profession with good people as quickly as bioethics is required. In this respect, it is a victim of its own success. A second reason may be bioethics' permeability as a discipline. Virtually anyone can be a bioethicist or make bioethical claims. To select a contrasting example, political theory is much more consistently rigorous than bioethics, in large part because it has a closed and internally oriented discourse. Rigor of the sort that political theory has, however, comes at the cost of comparative irrelevance. Politicians and policymakers don't turn to political theorists for guidance. And political theorists these days rarely even try to attract non-academic readers, even when they are making arguments about policy design and statecraft. By remaining open to non-philosophers, by contrast, bioethics retains its impact on policy and practice, but potentially at the cost of making reliably valid and sound claims. A third possible reason for bioethics' weak intellectual foundations is complementary, perhaps even in contradiction to the second. Namely, bioethics' very success at establishing its own field by generating its own journals, foundational texts, modes of inquiry, conferences, and so forth. The more that bioethics has separated itself from more general philosophy and from more general scientific, medical, and public health research and policy, the more detached bioethics has become from both the most rigorous work and the most pressing problems in the broader fields. Furthermore, as bioethics has become ever more professionalized with designated roles for clinical bioethicist or consulting bioethicist, it risks paradoxically reducing researchers, clinicians, and policymakers' attentiveness to bioethical considerations. Doctors, scientists, and public health coordinators do not feel themselves bound to think about the ethical dimensions of their work because they are reassured that others are doing that thinking for them, that they would be told if there was a problem. In all of these respects, bioethics may be a cautionary victim of its own success. So as I advocate to create a field of educational ethics, therefore, I worry about replicating bioethics' weaknesses just as much as I fantasize about replicating its successes. In learning from bioethicists who were around at the founding, for example, I have heard consistently that, at least in the United States, presidential bioethics commissions were essential for the creation of the field. Before the 2016 presidential election here in the US, I was therefore working on a proposal to send to Hillary Clinton's transition team, arguing in favor of a presidential commission on educational ethics modeled after the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. I abandoned this project after Trump was elected. I imagined it's addressing such topics as curriculum and assessment design, teacher preparation, special education reforms, and use of data to track students across their lifespan. I have similarly imagined what life would be like if every major school district, charter management organization, State Department of Education, and Ministry of Education had clinical educational ethicists as consultants or on staff. School leaders, teachers, after-school providers, and federal education officials might not agonize in private about the ethical dimensions of their practices and policies, but would actually seek out others for consultation and have reports they could turn to for guidance. Many days, I think that this vision has to be better than the silence or the fight to the death duels over educational ethics that we currently face. But many other days, I fear the potential results of defining and professionalizing educational ethics. What if the result is that teachers, school and district leaders, and policymakers reflect less often about the ethical dimensions of their work? What if they simply refer the problem upstairs to the poorly trained clinical educational ethicist who sits isolated in an office somewhere? What if the huge number of mediocre education research journals is augmented by a few even worse journals of educational ethics that ask questions only other professional educational ethicists are interested in and answer them in ways that would never pass muster if submitted to more general philosophical, social scientific, or policy and practice-oriented journals? What if, in other words, we end up replicating all of bioethics' ills and potentially achieve few of its accomplishments? So one of the questions that I'm trying to answer, therefore, and which I'm really inviting you to think about together with me, is whether the institutional roles that bioethicists occupy as clinical and policy consultants, distinguished commission members, journal editors, public commentators, academics occupying tenure lines, institutional review board members, and so forth, are intrinsic to or distinguishable from the goals of bioethics itself. So let me explain. So simplifying enormously, I think that bioethics developed historically to address three kinds of problems. First was the problem of large numbers of people treating many other, particularly vulnerable people, unethically in the name of scientific and medical progress. In the United States, two of the most infamous examples of this are the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which African American men were deliberately denied treatment for syphilis despite their seeking such treatment in order to study the progress of the disease. And then also the research done at Willowbrook State School, where intellectually disabled children were intentionally infected with hepatitis in order to research the disease and vaccine development. One reason that these studies, and really a surprising number of others, were taken to be ethically significant, and that biomedical research ethics were thought to be a necessary response, was precisely that they were not hidden. They couldn't be blamed on a few bad apples working in secret, or on rogue doctors and scientists who flouted the collective consensus about what was medically or experimentally acceptable. Rather, they proceeded in full view, at least for some observers. Once Tuskegee and Willowbrook were acknowledged, or maybe reimagined, as ethical outrages then, they were thought to require an institutional response through the creation of institutional review boards that review human subjects research and the like. The idea was that even well-meaning researchers and clinicians might make ethical mistakes, and hence that a proactive institutional structure was necessary, rather than something more individualized, reactive, or one-off. The second problem that bioethics was created to address was that new technologies were enabling scientific and medical procedures and outcomes that either ended up in or even created ethically uncharted waters. Here, think of end-of-life care, designer babies, stem cell research, and gene editing. Bioethics came of age during the DNA revolution, alongside, say in the United States, the American public fiercely debating Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion, and debating who should have the right to design Karen N. Quinlan's and later Terry Schiavo's life-extending care. All of these technological innovations and the ethical quandaries they sparked provoked a flowering of new theoretical work, as well as a raft of new public roles. This third challenge, then, of how to resolve disputes about what is ethically required, permitted, or forbidden in specific clinical cases, and about who has the authority to decide, especially, say, when the patient's judgment is in question because he or she is a child or is incapacitated in some way. This is what spurred the development of a whole class of clinical bioethicists and consulting bioethicists. So most large hospitals in the United States, for example, now have on-call clinical ethics teams who are available to consult with medical staff, families, and hospital administrators, often on a same-day or 24-hour basis. Alongside the explosion of clinical roles came a flowering of policymaking and policy advising bodies that either focused directly on ethics or invited ethicists to the table. As I mentioned, the most prominent of these in the United States has been the Presidential Commissions on Bioethics. In just one 5-year period from 1978 to 1983, for example, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research published influential white papers on defining death, setting forth guidelines that were adopted by almost all states and medical facilities in the United States, making healthcare decisions, screening and counseling for genetic conditions, securing access to healthcare, and splicing life, the social and ethical issues of genetic engineering with human beings, as well as a half-dozen other reports. Although many of these white papers and policy recommendations and the like have been focused on novel questions prompted by technological advances in science and medicine, they have also expanded to address population questions about vaccinations, quarantine, distribution of health resources, and evaluation metrics, such as QALYs, or Quality Adjusted Life Years, and DALYs, Disability Adjusted Life Years. Bioethical advisors, in particular philosophers working in tandem with scientists and doctors, have had an enormous impact in health policy and population-level decisions at the World Health Organization and other international bodies. So let me step back for a moment from the professional roles that people have come to fill in bioethics and return to the major problems that bioethics came into being to address. Widespread unethical practices, technological advances that create novel ethical dilemmas for which no answers could yet have been developed, and lack of mechanisms for dispute resolution. In my view, educational policy and practice face these same challenges. Consider, for example, 3 examples of widespread and widely accepted, but I think patently unethical, treatment of children in the United States in the name of educational progress. First, as I mentioned more briefly above, children as young as 5 are expected in literally hundreds of schools around the country to sit in virtual silence for 6 hours a day, including lunchtime. There is no recess. To hold their bodies in prescribed positions while sitting in class and walking down the hallways, and to accept punishment uncomplainingly if they violate these expectations. Unsurprisingly, these children are overwhelmingly brown and black and poor. Educators and policymakers try to justify this treatment of highly vulnerable populations on the grounds I had said before that zip or postal code should not be destiny, and that their educational needs are so urgent that developmentally appropriate educational practices do not apply. That's example number 1. Second, consider the fact that nearly half of all school districts around the country shame children whose parents owe money for school lunch. Shaming practices include stamping children's hands, "I need lunch money," throwing children's food away, publicly distributing dunning letters, requiring children to do physical labor to earn lunch, such as cleaning up the cafeteria and taking out the trash, and denying children food entirely. As a third example of widespread unethical behavior, consider again in the United States that over 300,000 children per year face criminal charges and fines for offenses that include skipping school, arriving late, wearing inappropriate jewelry, violating uniform policy, writing on desks, and not making eye contact. Students who fail to pay these fines can end up being incarcerated. So if nothing else, educational ethics should find a means of taking treatments of vulnerable populations like these totally off the table. In some cases, theory development might be useful. For example, in the case of schools being designed around incredibly deferred gratification, making 5-year-olds control their bodies for 6 hours a day. In other cases, such as the lunch money shaming or incarceration of children for non-criminally violating school rules, I don't think we need complex ethical theory, right? We just need to find a way to draw public attention to the issues, create an outcry, build demand for policy reforms, and so forth. So part of the reason that I'm advocating for a field of educational ethics is because I think that it could help promote these goals and mechanisms. Let me give some ways in which I think that educational ethicists could make headway against just unethical policy and practice. And remember, these are not bad apples or just, individual actors who are doing this. These are systemic and widespread. So some of the ways include, say, convening international bodies to create consensus guidelines or documents that account for the vast differences among settings and contexts, while also delineating bright lines that no school or system should cross. Or perhaps proposing a set of questions that, say, a system must answer, as in any application to do human subjects research, that will push against unethical practices and relationships. A second approach, which a number of bioethicists have recommended that I try, is to convene or join an advisory body to create an assessment metric for educational ethics. I should say I personally find this somewhat uninspiring and, if anything, distasteful, because I feel that the last thing we need in education is yet one more standardized assessment metric. But on the other hand, bioethicists have pointed out to me how transformative the concept of the quality adjusted life year, has been to public health policy around the world. By having a standardized measure for health, international and national and even local bodies have been able to make rational, reasonable, and transparent decisions about how and where to allocate resources. Money, hospitals, public health workers, kidneys, vaccines. And the only way they've been able to do that is through having a standard and standardized metric. It's possible that we could do something similar in education, although I should confess I remain somewhat skeptical, and I'm really interested in hearing what you guys think about this. Other ways in which educational ethics could help reduce unethical practice and policy, I think, is by giving people in institutions clear pathways or techniques, even gold stars, for making their policies and practices more ethical. We could establish special designations or even prizes for educators, school partners, districts, state agencies, or ministries of education that are particularly bold or successful in making ethical progress. Okay, so that was the first problem shared between bioethics and educational ethics, that of widespread unethical behavior. Let's now move on to the hard problems question, which was the second one. So as in medicine and public health and biomedical sciences, I think there are a number of educational practices and policies that have strong ethical valences, but exist in currently uncharted ethical waters. Let me give 3 examples. The first 2 from the new technologies raise new questions side of the ledger. It's possible that digital technologies will enable much more efficient and broadly effective approaches to educational personalization that have existed until now. It's imaginable, I think, in not too long a time, that students sitting in the same room could simultaneously pursue entirely different math, science, or even writing and history curricula, and do so for years on end. There are a number of ethically appealing features of extreme personalization, starting with the ideals of serving every child's individual needs and enabling outstanding students to achieve excellence, as well as serving those who need a really intense, assistance. But there are also a number of ethically concerning features, including the potential that educational outcomes will be even more unequal than they are today. and that classrooms may no longer function as mini civil societies in which diverse people learn to work with one another over time. I have no idea how these ethical ideas and cautions stack up against one another, nor whether empirical evidence points in one direction or another about the likely outcomes of massively personalized learning. But it does seem like an important set of questions to tackle. Second, we know that we are now all living in the world of big data. Many of the concerns that have been raised about corporations or governments using and aggregating big data to track adults, those concerns rely on a presumption of autonomy and rights to privacy. But neither autonomy nor rights of privacy are thought necessarily to apply to children. Children, by definition, are subject to paternalistic intervention and control by adults. Forced school attendance is but one example of this. And so perhaps some of the concerns that are raised with regard to adults about the use of big data maybe don't apply to children in the same way. But nonetheless, clearly we should also not accept that children will be subject to total and totalizing surveillance and assessment through the use of big data, even though this certainly seems like a possibility as data sources grow and can increasingly be connected to one another. So there's some clear benefits that might result from linking, say, academic data about children to their health records, to records from social service agencies, and, say, records from the justice system about their own involvement or their parents' or guardians' involvement. Problems may be able to be identified earlier and remediated faster. Children could be surrounded by a network of care and support. But also, very clearly, children could ever more readily be labeled, segregated, denied services, punished, written off, and so forth. As another example of an ethical challenge coming about with big data, I think even within a single big data system, such as Google Classroom, machine learning and ordinary language processing can help identify students, say, who have dyslexia, which could be identified by how they are typing, not only what they've typed, but also, say, patterns in their typing, or, say, who are at risk of suicide, which can be looked at through content analysis. And on the other flip side, it could be used, say, to identify students who have non-mainstream political beliefs, or to track how on-track students are, how much time they're spending on task, and to punish them if they're not spending enough time. We don't want children to learn that it's appropriate for citizens to be subject to constant and pervasive surveillance. But how should we draw these lines? This also feels like a really rich set of questions to tackle. And some work is obviously already being done in this area, but I think there's a lot more work that remains to be done. Third, let me give you an example of an ethical question that bedevils education policy, even in the absence of technological revolutions. What weight should standardized tests or any other short-term measure have, if any, in determining high-stakes outcomes, including students' promotion or retention in grade, students' school admission, teacher and school leader job retention, or school closure? These questions are often asked in light of standardized tests' many flaws as reliable and valid determinants of academic learning. But I think it's at least as important to consider whether any short-term measure can and should serve as a reliable proxy for long-term outcomes, such as economic self-sufficiency, civic engagement, or well-being that we won't and can't know for decades down the line, especially when these uncertain long-term outcomes are posed against some known short-term harms, such as, say, having one's school closed. Again, I believe that theory development, public ethical inquiry, and consensus building should be central to education policy in these areas and in many others, right? These are, again, only examples. They are not meant to cover the field in any way. So I think that having a defined field of educational ethics could help, including having scholarly, policy-oriented, and clinical training strands. There's lots more to say about all of this, and as I've just mentioned, lots of additional questions and concerns I haven't discussed. For example, I don't know how to mark off where education ends and other domains such as health or politics or the economy begin. Nor am I sure how different the domain of educational ethics is from other sectors of professional ethics such as legal ethics, bioethics, administrative ethics, and so forth. I also remain fundamentally concerned about how to ensure that educational ethics remains relevant to educational practice, not just a stale academic discipline, and how to create structures and systems, therefore, that truly incorporate and value multiple perspectives and multiple professional and experiential standpoints. But I do hope that I have at least convinced you that this is a project worth attempting and that some of you might be interested in collaborating on to develop further and to bring to fruition. Thank you, and I really look forward to the conversation.
So we want to thank you so much for an amazing keynote, Meira, and I'm going to be moderating the question and answer, and I might just take this opportunity to ask the first question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So as a moral philosopher who's writing on moral education, I'm very sympathetic to your argument, and I think it's some amazing work that you're doing. But one of the things that is a problem I tackle, and I'd like to hear your answer to it, is with bioethics and applied ethics in particular. We know that people weigh the principles differently, and of course, as you pointed out, the contextual questions when we have to try and solve ethical dilemmas are tricky. There are many different stakeholders. And when people are trying to weigh autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice, they come up with different answers. And so animal ethics committees and human ethics committees, there's been studies that show you give them two groups of people with the relevant stakeholders making these decisions, they don't come to the same conclusions in different times and places. So how do we have it that moral philosophers and educational ethicists can help us to guide this policy-making process?
That's a great question. So I think that's one of the reasons that I try to distinguish between the unethical practices and policies side of the ledger and the hard problems side of the ledger. So I think that the kinds of disagreements that you're describing are inevitable and unresolvable in some ways, except for when you have to say set a policy, right? And so at some point, a decision has to be made, even if there's still good arguments for the other side, and even if, say, some deliberative body might in fact choose a different policy, if it was composed of different people. So that's one of the reasons, actually, that I also I sort of elided over it. But in my talk, I talked about the role that say educational ethicists could play in mediating and guiding discussion about hard ethical issues. So it interests me that clinical bioethicists, some of them come in with either answers or clear principles where they can say, okay, the problem that you're describing is one of X, right? And we can help you work through that or figure out what the right answer is because of that. But many clinical bioethicists really work more as counselors and mediators, helping people with diverse perspectives and who exist in different places sort of on the experiential continuum have a real conversation with one another and reach a consensus, no matter what that consensus is. And I think that in educational ethics, there's similarly both roles to play. Sometimes it may be that we can help people identify and name certain principles or values or kinds of tensions, the individual versus the collective or something. And other times it may be that our role really is simply to facilitate a conversation that otherwise is not being had. Otherwise, people are seething in private, or they're hurling insults at one another about the other side's, amorality or immorality. And so if we could instead, foster a discussion, even though there are always going to be disagreements, I think that would probably be better.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there another question for Meira from our audience?
I'm Jennifer Leafy from Monash University. In Australia, for our ethics research committees, we have a national statement on ethical research, which is what we follow. Do you think it would be useful to develop something similar, like a national statement on educational ethics? And also, do you think children's rights, like the Convention on Children's Rights, I know the US hasn't ratified it yet.
No.
Has, yeah, but they say they
Like
intend
every piece
to.
of the world, yeah.
Do you think that would be play an important role in the educational ethics and in committees or a national statement or something like that?
That's a really great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, in ways, I'm just really curious to see how it plays out. So, I mean, and I'm also curious what you think, if you think it would be useful to have such a statement. I had a high school student this summer who was working for me because he was really interested in this stuff. It was great. I had him scan for the United States the 50 states for what kinds of ethics statements they had for both teachers and for school leaders, and also whether they required coursework in ethics to certify the teachers and the principals, and whether or not they had any kind of required assessment as part of the certification process. And what I found was pretty discouraging. I mean, there are a lot of ethics statements, and they're, you know, totally ignored, or they're on the order of don't steal the copy paper, right? And, you know, you should not molest your students, and that's true. You shouldn't do either of those things, but that's not particularly useful. So part of it is I'm not really sure if we're at the stage yet to say create a national or an international statement on educational ethics. This is where the sort of theory development side comes in, right? I think there's a lot of theory we have yet to develop that might need to be developed before we could take a clear stand. But it may be that actually through the process of trying to formulate a statement of educational ethics, that would help us clarify a bunch of things, and it could be very powerful. So I really don't know. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so the National Statement for Ethical Research, so I sit on an ethics committee at Monash University. Now, we really do use that statement, and that guides most of our decision making. I find that's quite a good, useful one. In terms of our, I guess we have teacher codes of ethics and stuff. I don't think they're very good. They would be like what you were saying, you know, don't molest your students, or they're too vague to be of any use, and everybody can interpret them basically to fit whatever they like. So I don't find them particularly good. But the one we have for ethical research, we definitely use that. Everybody on our ethics committee knows that. We refer to that document, but it's much more specific and you know, it gives really specific guidelines, and it's more useful. If we develop something, I think we could develop something more like that for education. I think it's possible to do that. It would be more useful. I think people worry that if things are specific, then you get stuck having to follow particular things, but of course they're always open to reconstruction. It doesn't mean the statement can't be criticised or developed or changed as you go along. But yeah, the teacher ones, they're too general. They're not much useful, the ones we have.
Yeah, that all seems totally plausible to me. I think about, I mean, one of the reasons at least that the research ethics statements work, I think, and are very influential here in the United States is because you can't do, say, you know, social science or basic science research, right, physical or biological science research without actually passing through the ethics board, right? So if you can't do your work without getting ethics approval, then it becomes very meaningful. Obviously, teachers are going to have to be able to do their work every day, and you know, school heads and so forth, without getting approval for all of their actions. So then the question is, where and how and when would an educational ethics, say, code kick into gear or be sort of practically implemented? And there it might be useful to look at medical ethics, legal ethics, journalistic ethics, other things where people are going about their practice every day. And when, if at all, are those codes of ethics really important to the profession? And it may be in part through the training, right? That I'm not sure.
Thank you. We have another question.
Kia ora, my name is Andrea. I'm a teacher in New Zealand, and in New Zealand we have a code of ethics which all are registered teachers, and every teacher that is in a school needs to be a registered teacher, and early childhood not so much. But we're bound to that code of ethics through our registration, and we have an educational council that helps to ensure that if there are queries, questions, problems that are going on, that's monitored. Is that something that do you think could be replicated or be looked at within the United States? Because I don't think that the Code of Ethics is excessively vague. I think it does stand pretty well where we are, but I could be just speaking for me and not everyone in New Zealand. So yeah, but yeah. So I don't know. Is that something that do you think would be helpful for an American context?
Sure. I mean, I'd love to see it if you'd be willing to email it to me. And to the extent that I'm trying to sort of, recruit, not so subtly, a group of people who would be interested in thinking together and collaborating on creating a field of educational ethics, since one of the key pieces, I think, would have to be some kind of articulation. And so I'd love to see it. I'd love to see it and think about it together, because it sounds as if your experience with it is actually positive.
Meira, would you like to say any final concluding comments or thoughts?
No, I would just say I'm, like all academics, and especially like academics at Harvard, I'm easy to find. We do everything that we can to make ourselves very visible. So I would really, welcome if any of you are interested in pursuing things further, please email me. You should also know that I'm actually fairly lousy at responding to emails, especially this semester, it seems. But you can always just re-ping me, and I would love to talk further with you guys about this. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person.
Thank you so much, Professor Meira Levinson.